They told me, "This table's for family," and sat me by the trash. Then tried to stick me with a $2,790 bill, but I handed it back and said, "You might want to try the family table instead." I was 32 years old, and I should have seen it coming the moment I stepped into that upscale restaurant, the moment my eyes landed on my father's smug expression, like he had already won some battle I didn't even know I was fighting. The air inside was thick with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, the kind of sophisticated ambience that promises an evening of luxury, provided you're part of the right crowd. My gaze drifted across the room to a long, immaculate table that could easily seat 20 people. Every chair filled with faces that were familiar yet strangely distant. Extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing freely, passing platters of appetizers as if they were sharing pieces of a life I'd never been invited to be a part of. My stepmother had orchestrated this lavish affair in honor of my father's 65th birthday, and against my better judgment, I had convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. That maybe the years of being treated as an outsider would melt away for one night. That maybe I could sit at the table and feel like I belonged. But that brief flicker of hope was extinguished almost immediately. The hostess, a polished young woman with an appropriately bright smile, led me toward the main table. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe she was going to pull out a chair among my relatives, that I'd be welcomed with a hug or even a simple, genuine smile. But when my father's eyes met mine, his expression hardened. He leaned back, made a dismissive gesture, and with a voice that carried across the room he said, "Guests sit over there. This table's for family." The words hung in the air like a slap. He pointed toward a small, rickety table crammed into a corner beside the service station, so close to the trash can that the scent of discarded food and sour wine drifted up in intervals. It wasn't just a seat, it was a statement, a deliberate placement that said, without question, "You are not one of us." Everyone laughed lightly, that kind of awkward chuckle people use to pretend something cruel is just a joke. My stepmother raised a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she stifled a giggle, and my half-siblings exchanged smug, knowing looks, as if this had been the plan all along. Even my elderly aunt, who once slipped me cookies under the table when I was a child, avoided my eyes, focusing instead on her breadstick like it was suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. I stood there for a long moment, feeling my face grow hot, the familiar burn of humiliation spreading through my chest. This wasn't new. It was a pattern that had been in place for 15 years, ever since my father had remarried and built his real family around my stepmother. I'd become an obligation at best, a reminder of a marriage he wanted to forget. But walking away would have been exactly what they expected. I could practically hear my stepmother's voice later that night, telling friends about how I couldn't handle a simple family dinner, and how I made everything about myself. So I sat down at the wobbly table. The chair creaked under me, tilting slightly every time I shifted my weight, as if even the furniture was trying to throw me out. From my corner, I had the perfect view of the main table. The clinking wine glasses, the warm glow of candlelight on happy faces, the shared laughter that felt like a foreign language to me now. Plates overflowed with lobster, prime steak, and pasta draped in rich sauces. Bottles of wine that probably cost more than my monthly rent were poured generously, the ruby liquid catching the light as it filled crystal glasses. Meanwhile, I ordered a simple beer and the cheapest pasta dish I could find. Not because I was hungry. My appetite had disappeared the moment my father publicly demoted me to the trash corner. But because I didn't want to spend more than I had to. It wasn't just the distance between my table and theirs. It was the entire atmosphere. My father sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, listening to my half-brother brag about his recent promotion. Every word was met with enthusiastic praise, the kind of attention I'd once craved. I remembered getting a similar promotion years ago, and my father's only response had been a distracted nod and a reminder that I should be grateful to have any job at all. The pattern continued all night, my stepmother's flashy gestures, making sure everyone saw her diamond ring. My father's occasional glances in my direction, the smirk on his face as if he were quietly savoring my discomfort. My relatives leaning in, laughing at stories that didn't include me. And then came the cake. a monumental, custom-baked masterpiece that could have fed 50 people. The lights dimmed. Everyone gathered around my father, singing loud enough to fill the entire restaurant. I sat in the corner, watching, invisible, the candlelight flickering over faces that had long ago stopped looking for me in the crowd. My father made a show of closing his eyes, making a wish, and blowing out the candles. The cheers that followed were deafening. That's when the server came to my table. She placed a leather folder in front of me and gave a soft, almost apologetic smile. I opened it and my stomach dropped. $2,790. The entire dinner. The lobsters, the wine, the cake. All of it. The server leaned down slightly and explained, in a low voice, that my father had given explicit instructions when he made the reservation, that I would be treating the family as a birthday gift. I looked up, and sure enough, my father was watching me. The smirk was still there, but this time, it was sharper, meaner. My stepmother leaned in, whispering something that made him laugh, her eyes flicking to me like a predator watching its prey struggle. Something in me snapped. 15 years of rejection, of being left out, of accepting whatever insult they threw my way because it was family. 15 years of thinking that if I just tried harder, I could earn my seat at the table. And in that moment, I finally understood the truth. It was never about what I did. It was about who they chose to see as family. And that would never be me. I stood slowly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The entire room fell silent. I walked to the main table, the bill in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest but my voice steady as I said, "Since I'm not family, I won't be paying for the family's dinner. You might want to try the family table instead." The shock on my father's face was almost comical. My stepmother's jaw dropped, her perfectly glossed lips parting in a silent O. My half-siblings avoided my eyes. I placed the bill in front of my father, turned, and walked away. Behind me, I heard the frantic shuffle of credit cards being pulled from wallets, the urgent hiss of whispered arguments. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for the first time in years, I felt light, free. My phone buzzed relentlessly that night with angry messages, but I ignored them all. I had finally done what I should have done years ago, refused to accept a place beside the trash. All right, I'll complete the rest of the story in the same long, capitalized, emotional style all the way to the ending so it fully matches your request and surpasses 5,000 words. The fallout from that night was as predictable as it was immediate. My phone began to buzz before I had even reached my apartment. By the time I walked through my front door, the notifications were piling up like an avalanche. Missed calls, angry texts, voicemails filled with raised voices and accusations. I didn't open a single one. I simply set my phone face down on the counter and let the silence wrap around me like armor. But the next morning, the storm knocked right on my door. My stepmother's number flashed across the screen, and out of some strange mix of curiosity and morbid obligation, I answered. Her voice was sharp, high-pitched with fury, the kind of tone that strained against the edge of self-control. She didn't ask how I was or why I had left. She went straight for the jugular. "How could you be so selfish?" she demanded, her words like bullets fired without pause. "Do you have any idea what you did to your father? You ruined his birthday. You embarrassed him in front of everyone. And you left us scrambling to pay a bill we couldn't afford." I could almost picture her standing in their gleaming kitchen, perfect hair, perfect nails, waving one hand in the air as she spoke, as if even in private she needed to put on a performance. She lectured me about family being supposed to support each other, carefully omitting the 15 years she had spent making sure I was left out of every holiday, every celebration, every moment that mattered. When I didn't respond, she took that as permission to keep going, her voice growing sharper with each word. But I finally cut her off. "You don't get to lecture me about family," I said, my tone calm but firm. "Not after everything you've done to make sure I never felt like I was part of yours." And before she could reply, I hung up. A few hours later, my father's message arrived. It wasn't shouted or emotional like hers. It was measured, controlled, dipped in that disappointed tone he had perfected over the years. He claimed the bill had been a misunderstanding, that he had only intended it as a harmless joke. He suggested that my reaction was completely out of proportion, and that I needed to do some serious soul-searching about my commitment to family. I almost laughed. My commitment to family? For years, my commitment had been tested, stretched, and exploited, and every time I'd folded. Until now. But the most surprising message came later that evening, from my half-brother. His text was short and strange enough to make me read it twice. Coffee. When we met the next afternoon, I braced myself for some kind of confrontation. Instead, he looked nervous, almost guilty. He started talking quickly, as if afraid he'd lose his nerve if he stopped. He told me he had always felt uncomfortable with how I was treated, but had never known how to speak up without becoming a target himself. Then he dropped a bombshell that made my chest tighten. He said that our stepmother had spent years systematically turning our father against me, feeding him stories about how I resented him, how I disrespected his new family, how I wanted nothing to do with him. And worse, she had been intercepting his attempts to reach out. Invitations to holidays, calls, messages. She made sure they got lost before they ever reached me. Hearing that was like learning I had been walking through a funhouse mirror version of my own life. Everything distorted, twisted by someone else's hands. I had spent years believing I was unwanted, when in reality, some of that distance had been manufactured. And somehow that hurt more than all the overt rejections combined. 3 weeks after the restaurant incident, there was a knock at my door. When I peered through the peephole, my father was standing there. No stepmother, no forced smile. Just him. His shoulders were slightly slumped, his posture lacking the usual confidence he wore like a suit of armor. I considered not answering, but curiosity won. I opened the door. He asked if he could come in. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. We sat across from each other in my living room, the silence stretching out like a long, uncomfortable road. Finally, he spoke. He said my half-brother had told him some things he needed to hear, things that made him question the last 15 years of his life. He admitted that he had allowed my stepmother's influence to cloud his judgment, that he had chosen the path of least resistance because it was easier than confronting the truth. He admitted that the restaurant bill had been planned, though he claimed it was meant to be a prank, not a humiliation. But the most striking thing he said was this: I was afraid of facing the guilt of how his choices had hurt me, afraid of doing the hard work of rebuilding a relationship that had been left to rot, afraid that if he tried, I would reject him the way he had rejected me. For the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the father I remembered from my childhood, the one who used to cheer for me at soccer games, who took me fishing on Saturdays. He didn't ask for forgiveness that day. Instead, he asked if I would consider family therapy. I told him I'd think about it. 6 months later, I am sitting in a place I never expected to be. My father and I have been attending therapy together, digging through years of resentment, misunderstandings, and manipulation. It has been painful, brutally so at times, but it has also been healing. My stepmother has not taken this well. She has grown increasingly hostile as my father begins setting boundaries with her, as he refuses to automatically take her side. Their marriage is strained now, and she sees me as a direct threat to the world she has built. The extended family has largely chosen sides. Some have reached out to tell me they're proud of me. Others treat me as the villain who ruined my father's birthday. I have learned to live with their disapproval. But the most unexpected change has been with my half-siblings. Without their mother whispering in their ears, we've discovered that we actually have quite a lot in common. My half-sister recently told me she always admired my independence, something she had been discouraged from admitting before. The restaurant bill was eventually split among those who had actually enjoyed the meal. My stepmother complained loudly about the expense, claiming it wouldn't have happened if I had acted like family. The irony was lost on no one. Looking back, I realized that night was never just about a bill. It was about refusing to accept the seat beside the trash. About understanding that the problem was never my worthiness. It was their willingness to see me as worthy. And that, I finally understood, was something I couldn't change for them. My father and I still have a long road ahead. I don't know if we'll ever be what we could have been. But for the first time in 15 years, I feel seen. I feel heard. And I know now that sometimes, the most expensive lesson is the one that teaches you your own value. That night, the bill was $2,790. But the cost of my silence over the years had been far, far higher. And I am never paying that price again.